Tonight, author Edward Ball will delve into the history of his new book, Life of a Klansman, A Family History in White Supremacy. Edward Ball is the author of 6 books, including The Inventor and the Tycoon, about the birth of moving pictures in California, and Slaves in the Family, an account of his family's history as slaveholders in South Carolina, which received the National Book Award for nonfiction. He has taught at Yale University and has been awarded fellowships by the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard and the New York Public Library's Coleman Center. He is also the recipient of a Public Scholar Award from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Many Alexandrians know Mr. Ball's work from his November 2015 Smithsonian article called Retracing Slavery's Trail of Tears, which examines the domestic slave trade and features Alexandria's Freedom House Museum. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Edward Ball. Thank you.
Hello, hello. It's good to see you. A thank you to the Alexandria Community Remembrance Project and to Audrey Davis, director of the Black History Museum in Alexandria. Thank you, Audrey, for your work and for asking me in today. I want to talk about the Ku Klux. The Ku Klux, a phrase that my grandparents' generation used in Louisiana to refer to the group, the militias, that operated during Reconstruction. The Ku Klux, words that show a familiarity which only people who knew actual marauders in the white supremacist movement, words that only they could use. Members of the Ku Klux Klan from 150 years ago, when they first came together, did not see themselves as founders of a movement. They would not have thought that their great-great-grandchildren would be talking about them. And yet, not only are we talking about the Ku Klux, the angry and ignorant and vicious gangs of Reconstruction, men who disguised themselves and hurt and sometimes killed people. Not only are we talking about them, we today are circulating ideas that recall those of the Ku Klux. And we are perpetrating acts that resemble those carried out by the first clans. Let me take you to El Paso, Texas. In August 2019, a marauder, a white terrorist, killed 22 people in a Walmart in El Paso. And he ruined the lives of hundreds of people. And he wrote a manifesto that talked about the white supremacy that was his guiding idea. Let me take you to Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017. When white supremacists took over a city, they beat up a lot of people. They killed one person. These people used language that Klansmen once coined and symbols that announced their identification with white racial status. The number 14 is a fairly new symbol. It's not an old one from Reconstruction. It refers to a creed in the sentence written by a founder of a supremacist cell called the Order, named David Lane. The sentence was 14 words long. We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. Let's go to Charleston, South Carolina, June 2015. A 21-year-old man goes into a church, the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, and sits in a prayer meeting. The 11 people there have their books open to the parable of the sower, and he kills 9 of them. He too writes a manifesto calling for a separate white nation. Dylan Roof was his name. His manifesto. Let's go to January 6, 2021, and the US Capitol, where a marauding mob, a large gang, stormed the Capitol building, many of them carrying white supremacist symbols. One person died. One thing about this photograph that all of us have seen, but few people have commented on, is that behind the man carrying the flag on the left is a portrait of John C. Calhoun, who was the philosopher of secession before the Civil War, a man lionized by white supremacists for more than a century. And his portrait hangs still in the Capitol. Among the symbols carried that day were the V Dare flag, which, described by the Washington Post, names an ethno-nationalist website that took its name from Virginia Dare, supposedly the first white child born in this continent. And this was a gesture raised high by many of the men as they stormed the Capitol. A relatively new coinage in white supremacist symbology, but a simple one, easily recognized. The assault on the Capitol may not have been a Klan operation, but it drew its energies from the barely submerged river of white supremacist thought and action that originates with the Klan. We are in a moment or a phase which has lasted several years that is punctuated by violent white supremacy. Since 2015, some 250 people have died from white supremacist violence that announces itself as racial vengeance. And that number does not include the police killings of unarmed African Americans. The status of those killings in a discussion of racial power can still be argued. Recent years seem to me like a return, like a remembrance of things past. These years seem familiar, despite the grotesque uniqueness of these many acts. And why are these things familiar? Today, I want to tell a story about where it all began. When I was a boy, I lived for a lot of years in Louisiana, down in the South, in New Orleans. That's the home of my mother's family. My mother's people have lived in New Orleans for about 200 years. My father's family are all from Charleston, South Carolina, on the other side of the Southeast. They have been there for about 300 years. I lived with my family in Charleston for a different part of my childhood. In New Orleans, my mother's family have been, and they remain, plain people. Clerks, tradesmen, school teachers, salesmen, carpenters, nurses, nobody at all with a higher education for 150 years until the 1970s. So when we arrived, we went there when I was about 10. We moved in with my grandmother into her bungalow, which is raised up against the floods that plagued New Orleans. Living with my grandmother also was a woman named Maude Lacorne, my grandmother's sister. We lived near Tulane University, for anyone who knows New Orleans, in the Carrollton district. My grandmother's sister, Maude Lacorne, was the person from whom I first learned about our Klansman. In the Deep South, in many families, whether Black or white or mixed race, there is often a family historian, usually a woman, a person who tells the family story to the rest of the group. She emphasizes the nice things, and she locks up the embarrassing stories. She keeps lists of births and deaths and marriages. She builds family trees. Aunt Maude, we called her, although she was my great aunt, was that person among my mother's people. She was about 75 when I first paid attention. She was a school teacher. She was unmarried, never married. She wore horn-rimmed glasses. She wore her long hair usually twisted up and bunched tight in a bun on the crown of her head. She had a closet full of gingham dresses, knee-length, with long sleeves. Come here, boy. Let me tell you about our people. Let me tell you about the Lacornes. The first one of our group to come here to New Orleans was a man named Yves Lacorne. Yves, he came from Brittany on the west coast of France. He was a sailor in Napoleon's navy. And as you will learn in school, Napoleon was involved in war from one end of the earth to the other. Yves was one of his junior officers. So the Emperor Napoleon sent a flotilla of ships to the Caribbean because there was an uprising in Saint-Domingue. That's the place they now call Haiti. When the ship arrived, Yves got off and he never got back on. And he put down his roots here. Yves Lacorne, when he was about 28, found himself a bride who was about 19, whose name was Marguerite Zourang, from a great sugar planting family in Bayou Lafourche. This is a photograph of one of the Zourang plantations. The Zourang family had too many daughters and they were in decline, and they consented or condescended to marry off this daughter to a sailor who washed in from the mother country. I say the mother country because everybody in this story is French, of course. They were speaking French. And despite the Americans having bought Louisiana from Napoleon, they remained French. Our people were French, you understand. And they remained French for another 100 years. And Yves and Marguerite moved into their little Creole cottage on Rue Dauphine in the French Quarter, and they had their 5 children. And among them was my grandfather. Constant Lacorne. Constant Lacorne. He was a redeemer. Do you know about the redemption? The redemption, that was after the Civil War, when the colored people had taken over the state and they started businesses. They were acting as though everything was theirs. They were voting. The redemption was after that time they call Reconstruction, that awful time. So my grandfather was involved in the redemption. Reconstruction was not when the South tried to build itself up after the war between the states, not when the houses were rebuilt that the Yankees had burned. No, the Reconstruction was when they put colored people in the seat of power. The redemption were the people who resisted that. So my grandfather Constant, he was a redeemer. He wanted to restore white supremacy. He got tied up with that White League. What is the White League, Aunt Maude? The White League, the only difference between the White League and the Ku Klux was that the White League wanted to do their business in public, whereas the Ku Klux wore disguise. What the Ku Klux did in secret, the White League did out in the open. And thank God for the White League, because they put the Negro out of the seat of power. And so it was from Aunt Maude, the family historian, that I first learned about our Klansmen. 30 years later, Maude having died, my parents having died, I'm cleaning out the family house and I find a batch of files labeled Lacorne. I begin to read, and I make a decision to tell the story of our Klansmen. I start traveling back and forth from my home in Connecticut to New Orleans to research in the archives. I hire a researcher in New Orleans to help me excavate the documentary record. And a life story begins to take shape. Constant Lacorne was born in 1832 to a French family in New Orleans. He's the second of 3 sons. His parents give his older brother the education, and Constant goes into a trade. He grows up a small, thin man, nervous and alert, sharp features, skinny nose, beautiful hands, an underbite, and a furrowed brow, a long wave of dark hair that turns white early. Constant's parents were of the class that lost their economic advantage. They started high and they slid. In New Orleans, nevertheless, his parents were among the 1/4 of whites who enslaved people. Constant's mother inherited 8 enslaved people from her parents, who had been planters. Constant's parents, having inherited, sold 4 of the women and men that they inherited and used that money to build a house. This is what we would call politely intergenerational white wealth. I do not know what happened to those 4 people. Constant's parents kept with them 4 other enslaved people named Ovid, Polly, Valentine, and Dinah. This is a record of the sale of Ovid. Constant's father was a supercargo, the one who washed ashore from the French Navy. A supercargo was a man who accompanied freight on ships around the Gulf. But he dies at age 54 when Constant, his son, is 8. And his mother cannot make the family work out. She has 5 minor children at this point, and she becomes entirely dependent on the 4 enslaved people. She hires them out. She leases them like real estate to whites who are more prosperous than she is, and that becomes the family income. At 24, in 1856, Constant marries a woman named Gabrielle Duchemin, age 19, an orphan of French descent from the Caribbean island of Martinique. And he becomes a ship carpenter, working on the barges and steamboats on the Mississippi. In 1860, the Civil War is approaching. Constant and his wife Gabrielle live in a rented house with their 2 children. His parents are dead. His mother, when she died, gave her enslaved people to her 5 children, who are now grown. Constant and Gabrielle received 2 of them, Ovid and Dinah. The house that they were living in, the rented house that they were living in on Cadiz Street at the levee of the Mississippi. Then the war begins. Constant fights for the Confederacy, as do 50,000 other white men in Louisiana. He and his wife invest in the fight, buying Confederate bonds, and they lose their money. When he comes home after 3 years, he's sick, exhausted, and bitter. He arrives in the city, as my Aunt Maude put it, full of carpetbaggers and with the Negroes twice as numerous. Now, with 3 children, Constant finds his livelihood wrecked. Their enslaved people are free and gone. New Orleans is indeed crowded with African Americans, much more so than before the Civil War. About 350,000 African Americans in Louisiana gain their freedom on the end of the war. Many thousands leave the plantations, the sugar and the cotton fields where they were enslaved, and they move to New Orleans. And Constant, working as a carpenter, now competes with Black craftsmen to make a living. And he does badly. Constant felt himself a victim. He saw the New World as anathema, and he descended into resentment. The government, as he saw it, was pro-Negro, and colored people actually held political office and actually ran businesses. 2 things that he regarded as a perversion. Reconstruction has begun. Reconstruction was the name of the first attempt to remake the US as a racially mixed democracy. To some, not least to 4 million ex-slaves, it meant power sharing with whites, perhaps even wealth sharing, and somewhere in the distance, shared humanity. These fantastical ideas, called radical Reconstruction by their millions of white opponents, met with mass obstruction and violent defiance. The Ku Klux Klan arose in Tennessee, probably in 1866 or early 1867, soon after the end of the Civil War, and it was a resistance movement. It was an armed militia that wanted to return the world to the hands of whites. It wanted to return a world to a status with only whites in economic and political authority. The name Ku Klux derives from the Greek kuklos, meaning circle, and gangs, as everyone knows, often dressed in costumes and masks. Klansmen made a cult of their disguise, wearing hoods to avoid identification by the army occupiers. Klansmen also knew that they had victims they might encounter from elsewhere in their lives. And if they were in disguise, they could torment them anonymously. In Louisiana, the Ku Klux Klan had other names. The Knights of the White Camellia was one. The White League was another. The Innocents. In Mississippi, there was the White Line. In North Carolina, the Red Shirts. The KKK grows as wide as the southern states of the former Confederacy for about 8 years. And alongside it were these parallel militias. Now, an early disguise of the white brigades was the costume of firemen. Volunteer fire companies in New Orleans were overstaffed and armed and made up of entire Confederate companies. Constant Lacorne's fire company was called Home, Hook, and Ladder, and it was made up of his former Company C from the 14th Regiment of the Louisiana Infantry. Constant took the extreme step and joined the armed resistance. He became a guerrilla fighter who wanted to return the South to white rule. He became a Klansman, one of the foot soldiers. He was not a leader, but a follower. The first major explosion in New Orleans occurred in July 1866, and the circumstantial evidence is preponderant that Constant Lacorne was there. At the Mechanics Institute, a meeting hall for tradesmen, during a convention of African Americans and their white colleagues in the Republican Party to agitate for the black vote for black men, there was an action taken that included many of the firemen. Home, Hook, and Ladder was called on the scene along with all the other fire companies to break up the meeting. The shooting started, and an assault of Klan rage left some 200 black people dead, according to one newspaper editor who was witness to these events. This was a massacre about voting. And it is relevant to observe that much of the fight during the election of 2020 was about voting. Who gets to vote, whose votes are counted, especially when it is black people who are voting. This is an image published in Harper's Magazine showing a scene from the rampage at the Mechanics Institute. During the next 8 years, evidence shows, Lacorne and perhaps 5,000 others in the state of Louisiana, the whole of them called Ku Klux by the public, raided and marched and beat people. Lacorne seems to have joined a group called the Knights of the White Camellia, led by a family friend named Alcibiade de Blanc. The aim of the Knights was to reverse black gains since emancipation by any means necessary. The Knights of the White Camellia were costumed and hooded. They harassed people, they conducted night raids, they whipped people, and they carried out individual killings. Between the summer of 1867 and the presidential election in the fall of 1868, their attacks left approximately 1,700 people dead or wounded in Louisiana, 90% of them black. This, according to an accounting made by the US Army, an agency within it known as the Freedmen's Bureau. According to court records, an attempted Klan coup is among the incidents in which my great-great-grandfather found his claim to glory. It happened in March 1873, after an election, when Constant joined a putsch against the state government. At home that night, before leaving for the action, he said goodbye to his wife Gabrielle and their 4 children, all of them younger than 12, because he did not expect to return. In the nighttime attack, Lacorne and an armed gang of 20 people, perhaps 30, surrounded a police depot in New Orleans, shot it up, and seized the building. This was to be one fork of a 2-pronged mission. A second group stormed the city's main armory, but failed to overcome its US Army defenders. Constant's gang, however, held its position, and a standoff ensued for days, with the US Army camped nearby. If the Ku Klux could bring down the Louisiana government even for a week, then the US Army, which held up the new and precarious civil rights laws and the new and precarious interracial government, could be forced to withdraw from the state, and white rule might be taken back. The army stormed the building, and one man was killed. Constant and the others were charged with treason and with violating the Ku Klux Klan Act. In Washington, Congress had hoped that its 1871 Klan Act would stamp out the white gangs in the South. The penalty for treason was, of course, death. The Klan penalty was 5 years. This is the bill of indictment describing the action in which Constant was involved. Constant Lacorne was not the only one in my family who fought for white rule. His cousins, his nephew, his brother-in-law, all joined him in the coup attempt. In addition, some of his distant cousins, married by marriage, his cousins, played greater roles in the militia with the medieval name, the Knights of the White Camellia, as well as in the White League, which succeeded it. In the treason case, the gallows were being argued when a sympathetic white judge dismissed all counts, freeing Constant and his co-conspirators. He returned to the street and to the fight. If you believe that to have a Klansman among one's relatives is a strange or deviant thing, think of this. In 1925, this is a photograph from about 1925, the Ku Klux Klan could claim 5 million members, white and Christian. The so-called Second Klan, historians call it. Now, it is likely, for publicity reasons, that they exaggerated the number of their membership. So let's assume actual Klan membership stood at about 4 million in 1925. The descendants of 4 million Klansmen count forward 100 years to their grandchildren and great-grandchildren in the year 2025. The descendants add up to about 135 million living white Americans. 135 million people form 50% of the white population of the United States. One of 2 whites have a family link to the Ku Klux. Every other white person, if he or she knew the names of his or her ancestors and wished to investigate their lives, might produce a Klan family memoir. For example, the president, or a president, the 45th president is the son of a man, Fred C. Trump, who was arrested in May 1927 in Queens, New York, at a march staged by the Ku Klux Klan. It was Memorial Day, and the Klan marchers, wearing robes and hoods, numbered about 1,000, according to the New York Times. Fred Trump was 25, and he lived in the Jamaica section of Queens. The 45th president, assuming that he possesses the skills of reading and writing, could himself produce a family history entitled Life of a Klansman. Why retrieve from obscurity this bitter and bloody story about Constant Lacorne, a foot soldier in the first white militias? I have a personal motive, and that is that it bothers me. It feels like I've found a corpse in the bedroom. I'm disgusted and I'm ashamed. I had an inkling that a great-grandfather was a violent supremacist, but I did not know, until researching it, just what this family member got up to. He was not a thoughtful man. He could write an invoice for his carpentry work, but that's all. Perhaps a letter. And he did not develop on his own the idea of white entitlement that still circulates like an odorless gas in the ductwork. But God knows he put poison in that gas, and he damaged the lives of hundreds. For public reasons and not personal ones, why revive this filthy story and bring it back? One reason is to try to harness the tale of Constant Lacorne, to repurpose it in some hope of shining a light on steps forward. Because 50 years after the end of the civil rights movement, the white and black divide is caustic and fresh. It is perhaps because the US possesses a tragic history, some of which many white Americans tend to be unaware of. In fact, much of this caustic history lies in the repressed parts of collective memory. White supremacy of all kinds, especially in our national history, is willfully denied and forgotten. We come to the end of Reconstruction. The last militia that Constant joins is called the White League. It is 1874. During the summer of that year, the White League fighters swell large, beginning as a fugitive faction of the movement into a mass brigade. And on September 14th, 1874, the White League stages a coup. In the so-called Battle of Canal Street, the Ku Klux, in other words, topples the state government. The scene resembles that of January 6, 2021. Thousands of marauders swarm the capital, in this case, the state capital in Louisiana. In this case, 35 people are killed. Constant is badly wounded during the clash. My Aunt Maude said that he had his head split open. But the White League holds the Capitol building for a week. The US Army again retakes power, but after this temporary victory, the Klansmen knew that they had lost the battle, and yet they had won the war. US troops soon withdraw from Louisiana and from the rest of the South. And by 1876, a white monopoly was again taking shape in the state and in the region of the South. Reconstruction comes to an end thanks in part to the Battle of Canal Street, and it is the beginning of 100 years of Jim Crow, the system of color caste. This is a monument built to celebrate the White League in New Orleans. It's a monument that stood for 125 years and was only taken down in 2018. 50 years after the end of the civil rights movement, tribal whiteness is once again with us. White identity extremism is quite strong in the public square. In October 2020, a month before the election, the Department of Homeland Security issued a report. the so-called Homeland Threat Assessment, which stated that ideologically motivated lone offenders and small groups will pose the greatest terrorist threat to the homeland, with domestic violent extremists presenting the most persistent and lethal threat. The report was referring to the white militias. White supremacy is not a distorted ideology. It is the early build of the nation, the United States 1.0. It lies beneath our institutions and in the channels of our minds. The idea of supremacy is not a deformation of thought, but a kind of thought itself. I have the idea that white supremacy might be compared to a river that runs underground in American history. It feeds the aquifers, it waters the national soil. But most of us are in denial about its presence, unaware of this river of whiteness. From time to time, white supremacy erupts onto the surface in a geyser. Then it subsides or is driven back down, returning to its channel. But it does not go away. Since about 2015, I think, we are in a geyser phase. I do not think we are in the midst of a return to the barbarism of the race wars of the Old South during Reconstruction, but there is little doubt to me that we are in a period of aggressive whiteness and anger. I said that the Klan won 150 years ago. I mean that the Ku Klux and people like Constant Lacorne made whiteness into an invisible norm. Supremacy was made natural, and it was made so in part by events in his life story. Lacorne's life and choices helped to cement white over black during a time when white domination was under threat, Reconstruction. After the Klan won the race battles of the post-Civil War South and the Jim Crow system was locked down, everyone knew that restoring whiteness to power following some years of retreat was the movement's lasting achievement. And so this man, my great-great-grandfather, touches the fingertips of current politics. His life makes visible the class resentments, the desire for ethnic purity, and the free-floating fear that underlie extremes of whiteness. It is persuasive to me that much of the hostility of white racial identity, which first announced itself in the first Klan campaigns, might be compared with events in the present. By telling the story of Constant Lacorne, I'm trying to make whiteness visible and substantial. I'm trying to draw the thing up and out into view, trying to make whiteness as conspicuous as blackness is to white people. That is because white supremacy is a kind of Caucasian identity politics. It's the idea that we are the people of comfort and authority and intelligence and beauty, the people naturally in the seat of power. And those feelings, those beliefs, those thoughts are woven into the making of many of us, consciously and unconsciously. Many of us find it difficult to talk about whiteness. We dislike being labeled members of a race. We dislike acknowledging the race's power. And that is because Ku Klux and people like Constant Lacorne succeeded during the redemption. They made whiteness a norm, part of the atmosphere. Now, if you think that I'm flattening all differences, making white people the same everywhere, I'm sorry, I must have skipped showing you a couple of slides. That's all right, we'll proceed. If you think I'm flattening all differences, making white people the same as Klansmen, please excuse me. I don't mean to do that. I have the idea that there is white supremacy and there is white supremacy. There is violent white supremacy. And on the distant length of the spectrum, there is a kinder, gentler kind, an atmospheric white supremacy that permeates the social common. I think that as soon as I stop talking, someone is going to say, what can I do? What is to be done about white supremacy? And one answer I have is uncomfortable, and that is to see it not as an alien phenomenon, but as something familiar, something even familial. I wrote this book, Life of a Klansman, in order to see whiteness as something familial, as well as for other reasons. But things are not only familial, they are tribal. It's an unfortunate truth to acknowledge that white people in general are heirs to and beneficiaries of supremacists and their terror campaigns, because those acts were and are committed in our name. They are crimes perpetrated for our benefit, and they do succeed in some mediated way in accruing advantage to white lives. And speaking about the actions of the Klan long ago, and also grotesquely, the actions in recent years. No, I do not think that we are in the midst of a return to the barbarism of the race wars of the Old South during Reconstruction. In fact, I think we have reason to feel optimistic. Last summer, the mass marches showed the country something new. After the killing of George Floyd, some 20 million people demonstrated in the streets for weeks, sometimes for months. And among the marchers were perhaps 1/3 of them white people. This is without precedent. The civil rights campaigns of 50 years ago and earlier involved the participation of whites at the ratio of 1 to 10. 1 white person, 9 black people. Last summer, the whites who marched are whites who might be seeing their own racial identity in a new way. And that is reason for optimism. So there is reason to hope. And I do have hope. In fact, I've had hope for a solid week now. Remember that my Aunt Maude told me about the redemption. My grandfather, Constant, was a redeemer. The redemption was a return to order, to the right order. I've had hope now for a solid week. We have had, it might turn out to be, a kind of redemption in the making. The inauguration 1 week ago was a kind of turning point. And in this redemption, the redemption that I hope lies ahead, the white militias and their silent supporters are going to be turned back. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think everyone is still kind of taking it all in, but it really speaks to how storytelling can share truth in a personal and incredibly meaningful way. And thank you for sharing your family's story and getting us all thinking.
Yes, indeed.
I'm going to remind everyone we do have the chat open if you have a question. If you found any of these, I assume, images in your family folders, and I think that speaks to a larger question of maybe a little bit pulling the curtain back on the research process and where you found these pieces, because I wonder how much your aunt saved versus what you had to collect on your own.
I found 3 to 4 pictures among my Aunt Maude's belongings and 20 to 30 pages of memoranda and records, marriage records, birth records, death records, and narrative accounts. But her genealogical work turned out to be perhaps 5% of the work that I eventually completed while writing this book. All of the other images, let's say, the images that include family members were from my Aunt Maude's materials, but all of the other images I managed to retrieve from archives, and I retrieved images that were directly relevant to the story of this person's life and evolution. It wasn't easy, but I enjoy archive work, you know, and I have a feeling that many people here take some pleasure in doing research. So I would say perhaps 5% was my Aunt Maude's portion of this work.
And there's 2 related questions to this. I'm going to ask the most recent one first. How does your family feel about your work, since it is a family story?
Yes, indeed. Well, it depends on who you ask. My mother's family, my parents are no longer alive. My mother's family comprised about 40 people, 45 people, principally in New Orleans and elsewhere in Louisiana, and a handful of them in Texas and Georgia and other parts of the South. And I was pleasantly surprised that no one in my family was interested in putting up obstacles to my doing this research and telling this story. The general feeling, if I can generalize, was Constant Lacorne. Now, he was a bad apple, and he's not in my branch of the family. He was from your branch of the family, and I don't know much about him anyway. There was a feeling of acknowledgement that we had a Klansman, at least one. In fact, we had several, but a general desire to keep him at arm's length. And that worked to my benefit. And it also allowed family members to to avoid the anger that they might have otherwise felt. And when I wrote a book 20 years ago called Slaves in the Family, which told the story of my father's family in South Carolina, who were large-scale slaveholders, and I told that story with none of the harsh parts erased. I encountered a lot of anguish and anger and pushback from family members in my father's family. But in this case, my mother's family in Louisiana, not so much.
And that actually, bringing up the other book and your father's side of the family, there was a question asking about if you found any evidence for that branch of your family and activity in the Ku Klux Klan or other related organizations.
In my father's family in South Carolina, South Carolina, for those who research Southern history, was one of the main Klan battlefields. And it was principally a Klan battlefield away from the coast, away from the city of Charleston, and 100 miles inland in the inland counties, the cotton counties. My father's family were coastal people, and they were also large landholders who lost much of their wealth after the Civil War. There were two or three that I found who were in what were called rifle clubs, which were militias that marched and flourished and made shows of force, carrying weapons and drilling in the streets. And perhaps these men also engaged in night riding. But I didn't find concrete evidence of the kind that I found with Constant Lacorne. And there's another thing to be said. There is a visible class component to Klan membership. The rank and file of Klan and white militias are typically working class men, and a small number of their leaders are propertied men with education and with money. And most of the members of the Ball family, my father's family in South Carolina, were not candidates for the rank and file, having been part of the plantation society. And so the circumstantial evidence is that they kept their distance from the marauding of the Klan in the Carolinas.
Thank you. And then this is another kind of related question, but going back to Constant Lacorne's side, did you find any evidence of children who basically followed in his footsteps and joined as well?
I did not find evidence of his children joining. The Ku Klux, in its initial formation, lasted from about 1866, 67 until 1880, when it went out of business because it had accomplished what it had set out to do, which was to restore white rule. So the militias stopped drilling, and they stopped their campaigns and their targeted killings, and kind of melted back into society. Some of them may have melted back into the early National Guard. Many of the National Guards throughout the South, when they were established initially in the 1880s, were made up of former militiamen from the supremacist movement. So by the time Constant's children, male children, he had 5 children who survived into adulthood. By the time they were adults, the Klan was not functioning. But there were other campaigns, as we know, to maintain white supremacy. And but I did not study carefully enough to find evidence of, and there is no, I haven't discovered a credible way to study the history of lynching that would allow you to identify people who lynched in these mob acts of brutality. The trail kind of runs out for me after Constant dies in 1886.
I'm going to read this question. It's a little bit longer, but it starts with, she's guessing that Klan members in the late 1800s, sorry, everything just shifted here, were less likely to be prosecuted for their actions than racists of today who perpetrate similar actions. For example, the recent insurrection at the Capitol. So her question is, given that assumption, any thoughts on why the Klan members in the 1800s would be covering their faces, and then today, where we have people out there with no coverings and posting widely on social media as far as their identity is concerned?
Yes, that's interesting. It's a different attitude. When the Klan first arose, they covered their faces because they lived in a world that they considered to be a military occupied state. The US Army patrolled the streets and patrolled the countryside. And if a person was seen trying to subvert the authority of the government, or a person was identified as the perpetrator of an act of night riding, that person could be reported to the authorities, and who would make an attempt to bring charges and retribution against that Klansman. So they disguised themselves. That was the initial reason, so that they could not be identified and hunted down. Now, it later became part of the mystique of the organization, the disguise, and they began to embroider their overalls with stars and colors and stripes, and sometimes they would wear these robes that they had stitched, or their wives had stitched. There were women who were at home working as seamstresses, designing the elaborate costumes that were sort of ghost-like for their husbands, and that actually raised the menace in the minds of the public who were reading about them and were hearing about them. Now, today is a different day, isn't it? As you suggest, where people are advertising themselves. It's part of our culture of self-advertisement. of self-display, of making a spectacle of one's life for strangers. This is something that has arisen in the past 20 years, I think. It is true that when the militiamen engage in various acts, they spend a lot of time taking selfies. So it's a curious kind of revision of the old I don't want to be seen ethic of the original Klan. Just one more word. The second Ku Klux Klan, which arose in the 19-teens and 20s, is the Klan movement that invented the white sheets, white hood costume, uniform, if you like. And they made quite an emphasis on public spectacle around their marches and their parades and their burning crosses, all of which were filmed and photographed. So perhaps the changeover to sort of self-promotion goes further back than social media.
Thank you for bringing up the second wave. That's come up a bit in the questions. I know we beforehand had talked about wrapping up around 8:15, so I can't quite get to all of them, but I have one larger question that maybe leads people to next steps, and maybe you can roll this last one that just came in, talking about speaking to women's involvement in the Klan, and rolling that into this larger question. Sorry, it just rolled away. And it's a bit of a statement as well. It feels that many are now understanding and accepting inequity and white privilege and thinking how to contribute to change. And then the question is, what are ways to help white people become more aware of their own historical connection to the history of white supremacy, which you point out is connected to privilege, but that direct connection isn't the same, and it feels much harder to own and take responsibility for.
Yeah, it's difficult. You know, the victories of the civil rights movement 50 years ago, the Fair Housing Act, the Voting Rights Act, the beginnings of affirmative action in the 1970s. These were great events, and won with sweat and tears. And these are things that came down, if you like, from the government as legislation, as policy changes imposed within the law, within the framework of the law. And they've had tremendous advantageous, they've done wonderful things, despite all of the assaults on them. Now, I think that the next phase of, what would you call it? Can I use an old-fashioned word? Liberation? The next phase of equity making is going to be personal, it's going to be interpersonal, it's going to be one person at a time, it's going to take place within the conscious and sometimes even the unconscious mind of the individual. It's going to take place at the face of a mirror. And it's going to take a lot more effort, and so much so that it will make the hard-won successes of civil rights look comparatively easily got. What I've done is to look at my own family in an almost obsessively close way. I've tried to see what emerged from this small group of individuals that has a historical relevance and that has effects beyond our family unit. And it's not something that's easily done. It's not something that's even easily taught, but I have found it worth trying to do. Looking at myself, looking at the things that made me and made my family what they are, and seeing them in historical context. How did we become who we are through the influences of history? And how do our minds take shape based upon the events of the past, perhaps even the distant past?
Well, thank you so much, Edward, for sharing your story. And actually, it brought to mind, I keep some quotes around my desk, and your story and your comments brought to mind a quote I have from Latasha Morrison. She found it, "Be the Bridge, which pursues racial reconciliation." And she's also an author. And the quote from her is, "Forgiveness and healing cannot begin until we become aware of the historical roots of the problem and acknowledge the harm caused." I think your story and the research there is one of those steps we can all be taken to become aware of the historical roots and acknowledge the harm as this process of reconciliation continues. So for all of our guests, I know there were still some more questions, and I'm sorry I couldn't get to them all, but I put in Edward Ball's website, which is simply edwardball.com, so you can remember that. I'll be emailing everyone after the event with our list of upcoming events. I'll have a flyer attached, so hopefully you can join us for one of our many lectures coming up around Black History Month. And then we'll be restarting our Alexandria Community Remembrance Project series of lectures in March. So keep an eye out on our webpage.
Can I do some self-advertising?
Absolutely.
If you are interested in this book, Life of a Klansman, it's for sale. And I wish I could sign it for you, but things being what they are, that would have to wait for another day.
And there's information on your website for purchasing the book.
You can find it on my website. The story that I told is much more richly evoked in the book than I was able to render it here in 40 minutes. So think about it.
Fair. Yes, and we've had many kudos and thanks. The storytelling, the richness of it was amazing.
Well, thank you all. Thank you so much for having me in, and Godspeed to all, and be well in this difficult time.